Every year, more than 1 million Americans open a DNA report expecting a tidy pie chart of European nations. A striking number instead find a slice they never anticipated: African ancestry, sitting quietly in their genome with no family story attached to it at all. Not just among people who identify as black, among people who have identified as white for generations, among Latino families who never associated their heritage with Africa at all, among people in states as far from the old plantation South as Utah and Maine. That's not a scattering of coincidences. When geneticists began mapping it systematically, they found something far larger: African ancestry embedded in measurable amounts across nearly every major population group in the United States, not concentrated in one community, distributed quietly and pervasively through the entire American family tree. So the question worth asking isn't whether African ancestry exists in America. Everyone already knows that. The real question is how it ended up nearly everywhere, inside families who never once considered themselves connected to it, and why the DNA remembers a history that so many households chose to leave out of the story entirely. To understand how thoroughly this ancestry spread, you have to start with scale most people underestimate. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, more than 12 million Africans were forced onto ships bound for the Americas, in a system that operated continuously for roughly 350 years, longer than the United States itself has existed as a nation. Roughly 400,000 arrived directly in what became the United States, a comparatively small fraction of the total trade, but one that would go on to produce an outsized share of the country's population growth through the generations that followed, largely because, unlike in the Caribbean or Brazil, the enslaved population in the American South saw high rates of natural increase, becoming self-sustaining and expanding for over 2 centuries after the legal slave trade ended in 1808. That distinction matters more than it first appears. In the Caribbean and Brazil, brutal working conditions on sugar plantations kept mortality so high that enslavers relied on a constant stream of new arrivals from Africa just to maintain their labor force. In the American South, the enslaved population instead grew from within, generation after generation, born on American soil, rarely with any direct memory of Africa at all, beyond what earlier generations had managed to pass down. That single demographic difference is part of why American-born black families accumulated so many generations of contact, coerced and otherwise, with the white population around them, layer upon layer, decades before emancipation ever arrived. That expansion happened inside a system that was never a closed loop. Enslaved people and enslavers did not live in separate, sealed worlds. They lived on the same plantations, in the same households, under the same roofs, in proximity that the law tried to regulate but never eliminated. Genetic mixing began almost immediately after the first African arrivals reached American shores, and it never fully stopped, not during slavery, not after emancipation, not during Reconstruction, not during the 20th century that followed. Here's how scientists eventually measured the result, stripped to its essence. A person's genome is a mosaic, not a blend, built from segments that can be individually traced to specific ancestral populations. By comparing thousands of these segments against reference genomes representing populations from West Africa, Europe, and the Americas, researchers can estimate with real statistical confidence how much of a person's ancestry traces to each region and roughly how many generations back that ancestry entered the family line. In 2014, a research team led by geneticists Katarzyna Bryce and David Reich applied exactly this method to more than 160,000 Americans who had taken a commercial DNA test and agreed to participate in research. It remains one of the largest single-country ancestry surveys ever conducted and it gave scientists their first true population-level map of where African ancestry actually lived inside the American genome, rather than where the country's racial categories assumed it lived. The first finding confirmed what most people expected. Self-identified African Americans carried, on average, genomes that were roughly 73% African in origin. That number wasn't surprising to anyone. What was surprising was where else the researchers found African ancestry once they started looking beyond that single population. Roughly 1 in every 100 self-identified European Americans carried at least 1% African ancestry, a proportion large enough to indicate a documented African ancestor within the last 6 to 11 generations. Spread across the national population, that translates into millions of Americans who have spent their entire lives identifying as white, with families who never mentioned, and in most cases never knew, that African ancestry sat inside their own genome. That ancestry wasn't distributed evenly. It was concentrated overwhelmingly in the South, and most heavily in states like South Carolina and Louisiana, the 2 states where plantation slavery operated longest and at the largest scale relative to the free population. In parts of the antebellum South, enslaved people actually outnumbered free residents, a demographic reality that made sustained contact between the 2 populations, consensual and coerced alike, almost unavoidable over the span of generations. Researchers gave this pattern a name. They called it a genetic echo of the one-drop rule, the old legal doctrine, formally written into law in states like Virginia by the early 20th century, that classified any person with any known African ancestry as black, regardless of appearance. For decades after emancipation, some families with mixed ancestry who could physically pass as white made a calculated choice to do exactly that, not out of vanity, out of survival, weighed against very real and often violent consequences for anyone identified as black under Jim Crow. That choice, repeated across thousands of households, left almost no paper trail, no deed, no letter, no line in a family Bible documenting what had happened. But it left something else behind, something no fire or shredded document could destroy. A pattern quietly distributed across the genomes of millions of descendants, waiting for a science that didn't exist yet to finally read it. This wasn't only a phenomenon whispered about in family rumor. It has documented cases attached to real names. The writer Anatole Broyard spent decades as one of the most respected literary critics at the New York Times, known publicly as a white man of French descent. Only after his death did a widely read profile reveal that he had been born in New Orleans to a Creole family with African ancestry, and had made a deliberate choice, early in his career, to leave that identity behind entirely, distancing himself from family members who couldn't pass as he had. His story became known because a writer eventually uncovered it. Researchers believe thousands of similar cases never became a magazine profile or a biography. They became, instead, a single unexplained line in a family's story, a grandmother who didn't like to talk about her childhood, a birthplace that shifted depending on who was asking. Broyard's case wasn't unique in its outline, only in the fact that it became public. Historians who study passing describe it less as a single dramatic decision and more as a slow accumulation of small ones. A family moves to a new town where no one knows their history. A child stops being introduced to certain relatives at holidays. A surname is spelled slightly differently on a new set of documents, closing a door that had been left ajar in the previous generation. None of it required a single dramatic confession. It only required silence, repeated consistently enough, for long enough that the next generation grew up with no reason to ask questions at all. The African ancestry carried by African Americans today isn't a single undifferentiated signal either. Genetic analysis shows it traces disproportionately to specific regions along the west and west-central African coast, including Senegambia, the Bight of Benin, and the Congo Basin, mirroring the documented ports and trade routes the transatlantic slave trade relied on for centuries. In some cases, researchers can identify which African regions contributed most heavily to specific southern states, turning a single ancestry percentage into something closer to a map, connecting named river mouths on one continent to named counties on another. The other side of that same history carries its own number, and it's larger than most people assume. On average, self-identified African Americans carry close to 24% European ancestry. Nearly a quarter of the genetic material in the average African American genome traces back to Europe, not through voluntary migration or mutual courtship, but overwhelmingly through a system in which enslaved women had no legal right to refuse. Slaveholders who wrote laws claiming to protect racial purity fathered children with women they legally claimed to own as property, then raised a society built to deny that any of it had happened. That quarter of a genome is a record of sustained systemic violence that no plantation ledger, no census taker, and no official history ever chose to document. The DNA remembered exactly what the paperwork was built to hide. If the story stopped with black and white Americans, it would already be significant. It doesn't stop there. When researchers turn to Latino Americans, a population the census treats as a single ethnic category, they found African ancestry running through nearly every subgroup, though at wildly different levels, depending on each community's specific colonial history. Dominican Americans and Puerto Ricans, on average, carry substantially higher African ancestry than Mexican Americans, a direct legacy of the Caribbean's much deeper and more sustained involvement in the transatlantic slave trade compared to mainland Mexico. Cuban Americans fall somewhere in between, reflecting Cuba's own extensive plantation economy, one that continued importing enslaved Africans later into the 19th century than almost anywhere else in the hemisphere. A single census category, Latino, was quietly folding together several distinct African ancestry histories, each shaped by a different colonial power, a different economy, and a different century of forced migration. There's a population within the United States that makes this pattern even harder to ignore because it exists almost entirely outside the standard black-white narrative most Americans grew up with. In the Appalachian Mountains of Tennessee and Virginia, communities long known as Melungeons were for generations treated as a mysterious, ambiguous population, their origins the subject of local legend rather than documented history. Neighbors speculated they were descended from shipwrecked Portuguese sailors or lost Spanish explorers, or almost any story other than the one the DNA would eventually tell. Genetic testing on modern Melungeon descendants revealed a mixture of West African, European, and, in some lines, other ancestries, most likely tracing back to free people of color who moved into remote mountain settlements during the colonial era, precisely to escape the racial categorization enforced more rigidly in the lowland South. Isolated for generations, their ancestry didn't disappear. It simply stopped being spoken about, replaced by whichever legend felt safest, until DNA testing brought the actual answer back into the open. Even Native American communities carry this same layered history in measurable ways. Following the forced removal of tribes like the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole from the southeast to Indian Territory in the 1830s, a policy now remembered as the Trail of Tears, some of these nations held enslaved African Americans of their own, a fact many textbooks skip entirely. Following the Civil War, descendants of those enslaved individuals, known today as freedmen, became citizens of these tribal nations under treaties signed with the U.S. government, and generations of intermarriage followed. Today, some individuals with documented Cherokee or Creek citizenship carry African ancestry alongside indigenous ancestry, a genetic and legal reality still being negotiated in tribal courts and citizenship debates well into the 21st century, decades after the DNA itself had already settled the underlying question. None of this happened through any single event. It happened continuously across 4 centuries through mechanisms that shifted with every era but never fully stopped. During slavery, it happened through coercion on plantations across the South. During Reconstruction, as newly freed Black Americans and white Southerners navigated a dramatically altered social order, new relationships formed under different, though still deeply unequal, circumstances. During the Great Migration, when roughly 6 million Black Americans moved from the rural South to cities in the North and West, between 1910 and 1970, African ancestry that had once been concentrated in a handful of southern states spread into Chicago, Detroit, New York, and Los Angeles, mixing into entirely new regional populations within a single generation. A family whose ancestry had been rooted in the Mississippi Delta for 200 years might, within a few decades, have descendants scattered across a dozen northern cities, each branch quietly carrying the same inheritance into communities that had never had a plantation economy at all. That migration reshaped more than city populations. It reshaped who married whom in neighborhoods and workplaces the Jim Crow South had never allowed to exist. A steel worker's daughter in Chicago and a shopkeeper's son in Detroit might meet in the 1940s or 1950s in a city neither of their grandparents had ever set foot in, carrying ancestry from opposite ends of the old plantation South into a single new family line. Every one of those unions became one more thread the genome would eventually preserve, long after anyone remembered exactly how the two families had first crossed paths. Each of these waves left its own layer in the data, like sediment settling on top of sediment. Researchers can often distinguish ancestry that entered a family line during the colonial era from ancestry that arrived more recently, based on the length of the shared DNA segments involved. Older mixing produces shorter, more fragmented segments, broken apart by dozens of generations of recombination. More recent mixing produces longer, more intact stretches of shared DNA, still close enough in time that they haven't yet been fully shuffled apart. The genome isn't just recording that mixing happened. In many cases, it's recording roughly when, turning a single ancestry estimate into something closer to a rough timeline. These estimates carry the same honest caveats that apply to all ancestry data of this kind. The commercial testing databases researchers relied on are not a perfectly random sample of the American public, since only people who chose to purchase a test and consent to research are included. Percentages, especially small ones, carry real margins of error, and reference populations for some regions remain less finely resolved than others. But the broad pattern that African ancestry is present measurably and consistently across nearly every major demographic group in the country has been confirmed repeatedly by independent research teams using larger data sets and improved reference panels in the years since the original studies were published. The specific percentages have been refined. The underlying finding has not moved. What makes this pattern so striking isn't simply that it exists. It's that American racial categories were built legally and socially on the explicit assumption that it didn't. The one-drop rule, Jim Crow segregation, decades of anti-miscegenation laws that remained on the books in some states until the Supreme Court struck them down in the 1967 case Loving versus Virginia, all of it rested on the premise that black and white ancestry could be kept cleanly separate, permanently, through law and custom. Richard and Mildred Loving, the couple at the center of that case, were arrested in their own bedroom in 1958 simply for being married to each other, one white, one black, and indigenous, in a state that still insisted such a marriage could not legally exist. Their case didn't just change the law. It exposed how much energy the legal system had spent for centuries, trying to enforce a separation the genome shows never actually held. Consider what that means for the roughly 330 million people living in the United States today. A meaningful share of white Americans carry African ancestry connected directly to slavery, without any family knowledge of it. A meaningful share of Latino Americans carry African ancestry tracing to the Caribbean's plantation economy, folded into an identity that rarely gets discussed in those specific terms. Communities like the Melungeons carry African ancestry that survived centuries of deliberate ambiguity in the Appalachian Mountains. And within some Native American nations, African ancestry exists alongside indigenous ancestry as a matter of shared, sometimes contested, family and tribal history. Genetic ancestry and lived identity across every one of these groups have never mapped cleanly onto each other, and that gap tells its own story. A person's genome can carry meaningful African ancestry while their family has identified as something else entirely, sometimes for generations, sometimes because that identity was safer, sometimes because the truth was simply never passed down. Genetics can reveal where the ancestry came from. It cannot on its own tell you why a family chose the story it told, or dictate how a person should understand their own identity today. Those remain separate, deeply personal questions that no percentage on a report can answer. If you are an American watching this, there is a real statistical chance that some version of this story runs through your own genome, whether your family's name, region, or self-described heritage would ever suggest it or not. This isn't offered as speculation for effect. It follows directly from how widespread this mixing was, and how many distinct routes, plantations, port cities, mountain hideaways, tribal nations, and northern factory towns it traveled through to reach the present day. What the data makes clear is this: African DNA didn't stay confined to the population most visibly associated with it. It moved through plantations and into southern white families who quietly passed as something else. It moved through the Caribbean and into Latino communities whose census category never fully accounted for it. It moved into Appalachian mountain towns that spent 2 centuries deflecting questions about their own origins. It moved into native nations through forced removal, enslavement, and generations of intermarriage that followed. Piece by piece, contact by contact, it became part of the shared genetic inheritance of a country that spent most of its history insisting such a thing was impossible. That's the real discovery sitting inside these numbers. Long before any DNA test existed to measure it, long before any census taker checked a box, and long before any law tried to draw a permanent, enforceable line between populations, the mixing had already happened. Quietly, repeatedly, across every region and every generation the country has known. The genome never needed permission to record the truth. It simply waited, patiently, for a science precise enough to finally read what had been there in nearly every American family tree all along.